I do human-centered AI for digital health at UCSF. And let me just introduce the field a little bit. So, and by the way, first 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a lot about AI. No HCI, but that's just to set the stage to talk about all the HCI questions. So just bear with me at the beginning. So in this field, we have a lot of data streams, wearables, mobile devices, etc., that are fed into machine learning models to make predictions. And traditionally in AI for healthcare, you might think of those predictions as being used for diagnosis or screening. But an other application of these ML models that I study a lot is less so on that and more on predicting your repeat health events that's intervenable. So I'm going to focus on that paradigm for most of today. And so the data context tends to look like a multimodal stream of data from wearables that you could think of as the inputs to the machine learning model. And then you have corresponding health events, be they adverse health events or any other type of health event. That is the label. And so we try to predict these. And why do we try to predict these? The goal is to create a just-in-time digital intervention. In other words, intervening at the right moment. And so I tend to collaborate with behavior scientists who work in areas that I'm very passionate about. And for example, one of those is substance use. And so like, for example, at UCSF, one of my colleagues is the expert in behavior science techniques for young adults who vape e-cigarettes, who use e-cigarettes for either nicotine or cannabis or both. And so Dr. Nung Nguyen at UCSF, she's like the expert in that. She has the interventions figured out that are apparently efficacious. Where I come in is, okay, how can we use AI to deliver the intervention at the right time? Because you can have a very efficacious intervention, but if it's delivered at a time where no one wants to use it or can use it, then you have no efficacy basically without adherence. So that's what I'm trying to use AI to solve, or at least one of the many areas that I work in. And so my lab has partnered with a bunch of behavior scientists in many areas, and one of them is, again, in substance use and craving. Another one that we're looking at, and I think we have a paper about to come out in NPJ Mental Health Research, is on predicting blood pressure spikes using Fitbit and stress data, and also predicting stress using blood pressure and Fitbit data, same data set, different prediction tests, and different intervenable contexts. And kind of a side note, but like in this task, we're predicting not the blood pressure number, but a blood pressure spike. Because if you think about actionability from a clinical perspective, a 155 over a 102 blood pressure versus a 148 over 92, it's kind of the same action that you might take, even though those are different numbers. So we don't necessarily need to be super precise in the exact number that we predict. But predicting whether someone has that spike event is potentially the clinically intervenable action. So tall orders. And so how do we make this work? The key is personalized machine learning, which sounds very simple, and it kind of is conceptually. We train a separate AI model per person. So unlike the traditional AI for healthcare paradigm, like in diagnosis, where it's one AI model and you give that to everyone, this is very different. Everyone has their own AI model, and we make predictions repeatedly within the same person and then intervene using those predictions. And so, for example, the data sets could look like so, where we have, again, the biosignals over time and the adverse health event of interest, in this case, craving. And the data sets per person are like a training set that occurs earlier in time. And then the test set, also like the real world deployment set, is later in time for that same person. That's a little bit different than what probably a lot of y'all are used to when you think of data sets in healthcare. So the challenge here, though, when we're trying to personalize models, is that you have much fewer data labels than you would if you're training on a general data set. So how do we make that work? The key, and I'm sorry, I'm still on the AI part. I promise we'll get to the HCI stuff. The key is personalized, self-supervised learning. So I know this is Stanford and CS, so just quick raise of hands. When I say personalized, self-supervised learning, who's like, oh, okay, I know what he's talking about. Okay, so half and half, and I know this is recorded, so I'm just going to go over it really quickly. You actually already know what this is, even if you don't know that you know it. So ChatGPT, right? The first step of training ChatGPT is GPT, the foundation model. That is a foundation that can be fine-tuned to do a lot of tasks like respond to prompts well. It's kind of ironic that I'm coming to Stanford, who coined the term foundation model, to tell you what a foundation model is. But that's GPT is the foundation model. ChatGPT is the fine-tuning of the foundation model. So how was GPT created? Well, OpenAI mined all the text on the internet that they could get their hands on and trained a model to predict what's the next word given the previous sequences of words. I think you all know this. And so why was that amazing and groundbreaking once they put a lot of GPUs to it? Well, number one, traditional bottleneck, like back when I was at Stanford, it was, by the way, I graduated from Stanford, it was to getting data labels. That was the biggest challenge in terms of data engineering. And so everyone was putting a lot of effort into getting good labels and then training the model. But for this, the labels are free, so to speak, because you just take any text and first 9 words, input to the model, 10th word, that's the output to the model. So it's free. And so your only bottleneck is how much text can you get. So that's number one. Number two is that if you have a model that can predict a reasonable next word, given the previous sequences of words, then you have a model that understands language pretty well, that could at least predict what's the statistically significant, most next word. And that could be, if you can do that well, then theoretically you don't need too many additional labeled points to fine tune it to do something like predicting sentiment well, or responding to prompts in a way that aligns with what humans prefer based on reinforcement learning from human feedback, or whatever you're trying to fine tune it to do. So anyways, this talk's not about that, but I say all that just to say that we're doing the same thing, but for a wearable signal. So instead of trying to predict what's the next word given the previous sequences of words, we predict what's the missing portion of a biosignal given the surrounding portions of the biosignal or the other portions of the biosignal, which does exist. There are wearable foundation models out there, but we're doing it in a personalized manner, because just by wearing a wearable, and by the way, I have a colleague who always makes fun of me when I do this, but just by wearing a wearable and not doing anything else, you get a massive data set unlabeled per person recorded. And so what you can do is train that model in the self-supervised fashion to create a personalized foundation model that can then be fine-tuned to predict these challenging to predict traditionally health outcomes like stress or pressure spikes or craving of a substance. And of course, we could do this in a multimodal manner as well. So, given 2 biosignals, like given heart rate variability and accelerometry, predict the missing skin temperature, given like the skin temperature from time point 1 to 9, and the other signals from time point 1 to 10 predict time point 10 for skin temperature. And then you start to learn kind of for free, not free in terms of GPU, but free in terms of labels, like how does one person's biosignals, how do they relate to each other? When one person moves a lot and their heart rate goes up, how does that affect their skin temperature? And different people have different physiology, and it's going to affect people differently. But we could get all this for free just by someone wearing their wearable. So how does this do? Well, we first played around with it on some publicly available data sets. So this is a stress data set. Personalized model did way better than the generalized model. We played around with how much labeled data do we need in order for this to converge, and it was very few labels. So, you don't need to ask the user for a lot of data to calibrate the model. If you fix the number of labels, then the performance is way better. And so anyway, I could go on and on about when this works, and that's not fun. But what I really want to talk about is when this doesn't work, because I think that's the important part of where HCI can make a difference. And so one example, and that's going to be a theme of this whole talk, is like, where do things not work? And so I'll talk a little bit about where things work. I'm going to focus on where things fail, and these are where the opportunities for HCI are. And so one challenge that we encountered was that when we looked at a data set of nurses who were asked to wear a wearable during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and asked to annotate their stress during their shifts. Now, as you can imagine, it was a very stressful time, and long story short, there was a lack of adherence across nurses, and there was also a lot of variability in the labeling pattern. And this happened on many levels. So on one level, there was inconsistent labeling across nurses. Now, in theory, the personalization should be able to account for that. But that wasn't it. On top of that, there was inconsistent labeling within the same nurse. So like they were on one day, they were labeling differently than on the next day or even within the same day. So personalization all goes to trash if that's happening. And on top of that, it was a noisy data set, and it just made it really difficult to work. And so what that taught us is that just AI innovation by itself is not going to solve these fundamental issues with human behavior when we're trying to build models that serve people. And so that brings us now, with that long prologue of AI, to some core HCI questions and I'm going to talk about several today. So the first one is related to what I discussed before, is reducing user burden while maintaining the efficacy of the intervention. And so, again, I did my HCI master's here. I remember the how might we statement. So I tried, this one would probably not make an A, but I put it up here anyways, just in case. So how might we reduce the burden of personalizing AI models for users of digital therapeutics? Perhaps I could have just said for patients. So that number one, the AI model performs well, but two, user engagement is high. And so my lab has been taking many approaches to trying to solve this, some of which include AI. So one approach we've been taking is leveraging active learning. So active machine learning is the process of looking at the model's output. If you have a model that's doing binary classification, it's not outputting 0 or 1, it's outputting a probability of the event. So for example, if the model outputs 98% stress, then the model is really confident that it's stress. Or if it outputs 5% stress, it's very confident that it's not stress. But if it outputs something like 56%, technically it's predicting stress, but like it wasn't that confident because it was right by that 50% boundary. So that would be a good moment for the algorithm to obtain some calibration data from the end user. So we looked into that, and I wish it were that simple. But it's not, because, very simple example, what if you're a parent going to pick up your kid from school and the intervention is asking you to do something? So you can't just rely on the AI model. And so we have to take this layered approach of first looking at what the AI model says, then looking at what the patients maybe tell us beforehand would be useful, but then third, maybe using some passive sensing to look at context about their location, and we could infer if they're driving and things like that automatically. And so incorporating all of that into the model, but still intervening at the most important time. So we're looking into this kind of stuff. I am talking with many colleagues who are in HCI for mHealth who think about this, so it's not just me. And together with one of my mentors, who's Santosh Kumar at the M.Dot Center, he's helped me think through some causal diagrams of user behavior in mHealth. And together we've come up with this. This is a simplified example, or incomplete example, I should say, where you could argue that the timing of the intervention and the content of the intervention affect the burden to the end user. And the burden to the end user affects the receptivity of the user to the intervention. And the receptivity of the user or patient to the intervention affects their adherence and engagement, which are technically two separate things. Engagement is like, do you open the app and use it? Adherence is, are you actually following what it's asking you to do in terms of a behavior science standpoint? So this is incomplete, but this, and it's much more complex than this, but this gets at some of the key issues in the field that we're now designing studies to measure and account for. So that's HCI challenge number one. I'm going to go through a lot, so sorry if that wasn't in too much depth. But HCI challenge number two is now understanding how our choice of how to evaluate the AI model could affect what end users actually care about? So quick show of hands, how many people here, especially students, like have used scikit-learn before for like machine learning? Okay, so a fair amount of people. It's like very common. And the thing about scikit-learn and data scientists in general is that I found, and I know this because I mentor a lot of computer science students, including ICME students here at Stanford regularly and many other places. The way students tend to evaluate these models is let's use the evaluation metrics that come for free in scikit-learn. So how many of y'all are like using precision, recall, and F1 score? And you just go with that and you report whatever that says and you say that's the performance of your model and you call it a day. Probably a lot of folks. I see a lot of thumbs ups and nodding heads. But what's really important to think about is what do these metrics actually tell us and what do they not tell us in terms of patient and clinician use of these models. So to illustrate this point, let's dive deep into precision. So as an example. So precision, this is probably a review, but quick review, true positives over true positives plus false positives. So the denominator, true positives plus false positives, that's all the predicted positives. So precision is telling us out of all the positives, where positive here is not like happy, but it's like positive test results, so like positive for cancer, for example. Out of all of the people for whom the model predicted that they're positive for cancer, what percentage actually have cancer? So that's what precision tells us, which seems useful. But if you look into it, so TP, true positives, that's based on the number of positives. In other words, the maximum number that the true positive could be is how many positives you have in your data set. And similarly, for false positives, that's based on the number of negatives, because false positives means that it was falsely predicted to be positive. It's actually a negative. So this false positive number is driven by the number of negatives in your data set. And so if you have a model, the same model that's deployed in the population setting, like for example, a screening tool, then the prevalence of cancer is going to be very different than if you're deploying that exact same model, but in, say, a specialty clinic where the only people who use the AI model are people where there's a suspicion already of the condition. And so you have, because there's a different number of positives to negatives. And remember, true positives based on number of positives, false positives based on number of negatives. And so you could say that precision is sensitive to the population prevalence. The exact same AI model might look good in one setting and bad in another setting, and all that's changed is the population that it's evaluated on. So it's a big problem. And as a result, a lot of times in AI for healthcare, you don't see precision and recall, you see sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity, by the way, is just the recall. It's just, there's a lot of same words for the same, different words for the same concept. So for example, sensitivity is true positives over true positives plus false negatives. So the denominator of sensitivity is all of the actual positives. So sensitivity is what percentage of the actual positives are predicted to be positive. Specificity is basically the opposite. It's what percentage of the actual negatives are correctly predicted to be negative, and you could kind of work it out from the definitions. So the nice thing about these metrics is that the denominator is the actual number of positives, actual number of negatives, respectively. And so these metrics are not sensitive, no pun intended, to the population prevalence. These performance metrics will be the same, whether they're being used for general screening or for a highly specialty clinic. So that's important. However, all that being said, I'm going to get off my soapbox in a minute. When I told this to clinicians, they still prefer precision, nevertheless. I'm going to leave you hanging for a bit on why, but I'll come back to it in a minute. But right now, the takeaway is don't just use the default metrics that scikit-learn gives you, unless you know why. And similarly, if you're using Codex or you're letting AI models write code for you, you got to be really careful about the decisions that it's making, because these metrics may or might not tell you what you actually need to know. I see a question.
I'm curious. Obviously, one of the things that you could also do is you could report the entire confusion matrix, assuming that it sounds like we're only getting binary classification. I'm curious, like, because that gives you the numbers that you need to do all of these things, and also then somebody could then say, based on what I want to know, I can compute a metric.
Yeah. So the comment was, well, we could just display a confusion matrix. So it's like the 2x2 grid of, predicted and actual, and you could just look at that. That's a great point. In practice, people like using the metrics because they are interpretable. It's like these all have meanings, whereas the confusion matrix, you see like the Gestalt picture. You can also do a ROC curve, which is different because it's based on all decision thresholds. But the confusion matrix kind of gives you this overall picture. But a metric like sensitivity is telling you something very specific, which is So a lot of times people want metrics that are aligned to meaningful concepts. But yeah, I agree. I mean, having more confusion matrices would be good as well. Great question. Other questions? Okay, so I'll come back to why clinicians actually really do like precision in a minute, but I want to add one more HCI challenge, and then I know I didn't fully address HCI challenge number 2. I'll address both of them together. So HCI challenge number 3, related to the previous one, is that easy to implement AI modeling decisions can dramatically affect the end user, where the end user can be the patient or the clinician or both. So to illustrate this, here's a little toy example that I created. And so here the red data point, these are data points. And so the red circles are people who actually have cancer. And the green data points are people who actually don't have cancer. And they're all put on this line from 0 to 1, which purple line, which I know this HCI adding. I don't know if this color scheme is good, so I apologize. But on this purple line that represents the predicted probability of the model. And so usually by default, what people do is go by this 0.5 decision threshold. If the model predicts 0.52, I'm going to call it cancer. If it's 0.48, I'm going to call it no cancer. And you could see here that the effect of that is that we kind of have a model that's somewhat good at detecting positives, somewhat good at detecting negatives, but it's not really super great at either. But we don't have to go with the 0.5 decision threshold. We can, keeping the exact same learned model weights, change the threshold, set it to 0.3. So now if the model outputs 0.35, we would call that cancer. If the model outputs 0.28, we would call that no cancer. And so what happens here is that now we're identifying all of the cancer patients. Now there are some people who don't have cancer where the model predicts that they do have cancer. We'll talk about that in a moment. We could also go to the other extreme, so high specificity instead of high sensitivity, where if the model predicts cancer, we're absolutely confident that the true diagnosis is cancer. Now, we're missing a lot of people with cancer, but if the model says cancer, we know it's cancer. And these are kind of two extremes of the spectrum, and it's with the exact same AI model. All that we're changing is how we're using this same trained AI model. And so in my classes, I teach some like human-centered AI for health type classes at UCSF. And one thing that we like to do is think through what are different scenarios that students would prefer in different clinical situations. And usually what students, like the first reaction from students, I'm not going to have y'all vote on it because we have a lot to discuss, is the higher sensitivity scenario, so that we're going to catch everyone with cancer. And yeah, the model might misclassify some people who don't have cancer as cancer, but what's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to get seen in the clinic and then be told they're fine. Perhaps that's better than missing people who then don't get treated. And for cancer, I think I agree with that for sure. But the question becomes, for every clinical scenario, is higher sensitivity at the cost of specificity always what's preferred? So to answer that question, let me walk you through another scenario. So hospitalists, so doctors working in the hospital, often encounter patients who develop sepsis, which is an infection. And it's a very unpleasant infection and characterized by all of these effects, symptoms shown here, and it could often lead to death. And so Epic, for those who don't know, Epic is the main electronic health record system. So whenever you go to the doctor and they open up their computer screen, it shows all your stuff, that's Epic. By the way, super easy to code extensions to Epic. It's way easier than coding apps. There's not enough HCI people studying that. I'll come back to that in a second, but sidebar. So they open up the Epic portal, and it's interfaced with all of your patient data over time. And so Epic rolled out, so you can deploy your own Epic apps, but Epic rolled out their own app that was an Epic sepsis model, an AI model to predict risk of sepsis. And people started using it because it came with Epic in real world hospital settings, including UCSF and many other places. And later on, some people ran a validation study of this model and found, specifically measured its sensitivity and specificity, as well as its positive predictive value, which, by the way, is the same thing as precision. Remember, multiple words for the same concept, as well as negative predictive value. So the sensitivity and specificity look great, 86%. 81%. Oh, great, we have a good model. I mean, it does have the problem of it's not really great at anything. Maybe they could optimize the threshold, but it looks pretty good overall. But then the precision is 34%. So what does precision mean again? Remember, it's whenever the model makes a positive prediction, what is the actual likelihood that they actually have that condition? And so what ended up happening is because of the low precision, the model was always alerting the clinicians that the patient had sepsis, and most of the time they didn't have sepsis. And so this led to alert fatigue by the clinicians who became overwhelmed with all of these sepsis alerts, and eventually they just started ignoring them. And now I talk to my colleagues, so again, I'm at UCSF, a lot of my colleagues are clinician scientists, so they're both practicing doctors and researchers, and they're like, oh yeah, I just ignore that, the model sucks. And it looks good if you just look at the sensitivity and specificity, but the precision is so low, it causes this alert fatigue, and nobody actually wants to use it. Clinicians have lost trust in the model. By the way, great place to do, qualitative interviews is just talking to my colleagues at UCSF rather than running a formal study. So in the case of sepsis, clinicians prefer the high specificity models and, of course, high precision, even more importantly. Connecting this back to my field of mobile health, Apple Watch has also opted for specificity. So for those who don't know, Apple Watch, probably most of you know this, has a hypertension prediction model in it. And they published the performance of this model publicly, and here's what Apple Watch went with. So their sensitivity is in the low 40s, but their specificity is in the about 92%. So a couple things to opine on here. So number one, they could have just gone with like a 70-ish% sensitivity, 70-ish% specificity, the kind of the default thing that data scientists like to do. But what are you going to do with a model that's just like okay at doing both? There's not much you can actually do with that. So taking the exact same trained AI model, they optimized for specificity. And the reason they did this is because Apple, fortunately, consulted with clinicians when they were developing this feature, hired MDs who told them about this alert fatigue issue, and they were like, yeah, you got to make the specificity high. So Apple did that from the onset, which I think is great on Apple. That was a good move on their part. And so I think really what I want to emphasize here is just that you could look at it and be like, AUROC 70%, not great. But just tweak the decision threshold, high specificity, but low sensitivity. There are clinical use cases of such a model. So you got to really think about how these very simple modeling decisions can affect how the model is used. And this is one example. There are so many examples of this across the field. I'm trying to give like a beginner, like this is like some of the easiest stuff, but it keeps going and going and going. Like for every little line of code, it has these dramatic effects. And so there's so much to do and to study in HCI research to disentangle these. So I want to shift gears a little bit now and have a actually a long epilogue on the importance of stakeholder engagement. And in the process, I'll also reinforce some of the concepts that I've already discussed. So switching gears now from the prediction of repeat adverse health events to the more traditional diagnosis and screening in AI for healthcare. So my research lab created a digital Parkinson's assessment that was on a website. It was meant to assess tremor-related symptoms. And so on this on the website, there were some mouse tracing tasks and some keyboard pressing tasks and some cognitive assessments. And from the onset, we developed this. So this was back when before I was at UCSF, by the way, I was a professor at University of Hawaii in computer science. And so this work, the data collection for this work took place in Hawaii, where we went out to the community and participated in the Hawaii Parkinson's Association events to really meet some folks who actually had Parkinson's, as well as their spouses and others who helped inform us on how to build this assessment. We then also partnered with Jerry Boster, who was the president at the time of the Hawaii Parkinson's Association, who sadly passed away from Parkinson's, but he was very involved from the onset on our development of the assessment. And basically it turned into him just telling us what to build, and we're like, yeah, we'll build it. We were very happy to do that because he was very passionate about helping others with Parkinson's. And so through him, there were two levels of community engagement. There was like co-designing the assessment in the first place, and then there was community-based recruitment afterwards. So once we did that, we collected the data, we built some AI models, the AI models performed well. This is a little side result, but I think it's important. We found, interestingly, that the models performed better on Mac devices than Windows devices. The reason, and we actually had much less data for MacBooks than Windows. The reason I suspect is that MacBooks are much more homogeneous compared to Windows. And so, with Windows, there's a lot more variability. And so this could be an issue in terms of social determinants of health based on where MacBooks and Windows are accessible globally. We also found that the model performed better for right-handed versus left-handed individuals, which, for motor assessments, it can be problematic. And so this was kind of a big finding. Again, so looks like the model does great if you look at everyone, but when you break it apart between the different places that the model could be used, you find that, okay, well, it actually performs much better on some groups versus others. And so now my lab is really scaling this up and being like, okay, well, what about internet latency? What about webcam resolution? What about technological proficiency? What about age, which kind of relates to tech proficiency? A bunch of other factors that are proxies for social determinants of health, but directly measurable in these assessments. So we're doing that now. So as a little bit of a side note, we're also, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but we're doing like AI stuff to given that there are those discrepancies, to algorithmically mitigate them. So we have a paper in AMIA, which is the main medical informatics conference, to algorithmically using adversarial debiasing, which are like GANs, but for debiasing, to mitigate the bias, but that's for another day. But what's interesting for today is not so much about the method, but about the results, which is basically that we can engineer the model to be less biased, but how do we define bias? So I don't know who's familiar with the field of algorithmic fairness, but there are many different quantitative metrics that are out there for measuring bias of AI models. You might have heard of disparate impact and equalized odds and equal opportunity. These have started to become somewhat standard metrics in the field, but they all have different implications. Like one of them is basically the difference in sensitivity between groups. You can have one that's the difference in precision between groups. There's one that's disparate impact on the difference in just the positive prediction rate between groups, which is actually based on legal scenarios. That's what's used in legal settings, interestingly. But the thing is, so when we're optimizing the model, we can optimize it for any of these bias metrics, but oftentimes they conflict with each other. Differences in sensitivity between groups versus differences in specificity between groups, and many others. And so there's many ways to quantitatively measure bias, and therefore there's many different ways you can optimize for bias. And so the question isn't, can we make the model less biased? I mean, that is a question, but like there are and for AI, you tell it what to optimize, it'll, neural networks can learn anything. So that's possible for sure, but the question is, what do we optimize for in the first place? And that's like where we have a lot of work to do. And again, in my classes, we have some really interesting discussions about that. And we do the whole Jubilee thing where people go on this side of the room or that side of the room, depending on their opinions. So we have really fun classes discussing these. But I think there's a lot of formal HCI work that needs to be done in terms of like which of these are preferable under what context, because it's not always the same in every context. So that's one thing I wanted to reinforce. But really the reason I brought up this whole Parkinson's example is that you may have noticed I engaged the community and the patients, but who did we not engage in this process? So after I left University of Hawaii and moved to UCSF, all my colleagues were clinicians. And so then I took them showed them this Parkinson's assessment, and let's just say I learned a lot after we already ran the study. So what did I learn? Number one, okay, so medication timing is a major factor here. So in Parkinson's, once you're diagnosed, a common medication that's prescribed is called levodopa. It's meant to control motor symptoms. And so what usually tends to happen is that the symptoms go up, medication is taken, symptoms go down, but then symptoms start to come back up, medication gets taken again, and you have this cyclic process. So this brought up a few things in our study. So number one, we didn't account for medication timing at all. But number two, if we did, we might have designed it to look at these, to collect the data from the portions where the medication was lowest, because there's this chicken and egg problem where we were trying to create a early screening tool for Parkinson's, but in that setting, Parkinson's patients aren't taking levodopa yet. And yet our data were all from people who were taking levodopa because they were diagnosed and being treated for Parkinson's. Major confounder. So we didn't account for that at all. It could be accounted for. It also, I'm going to skip a few lessons ahead, brought us to something else we learned from clinicians, which is that, is predicting the diagnosis really what would be most useful to them? Because they told us that predicting Parkinson's symptoms would actually be much more actionable to them, because a common clinical practice is every 6 months, they come in and they get this MDS-UPDRS assessment to measure Parkinson's symptoms, and it takes up a lot of clinician time. It increases the waiting list times for getting an appointment and all of these things. So what would really make a difference is predicting that. And if that's what you're predicting, you don't even have to worry about this whole medication timing thing in the first place. So that's something that we learned. Another thing we learned going back is the asymmetry. So we studied this whole thing about right-handed versus left-handed participants. But a hallmark of Parkinson's disease is that there's asymmetric onset. So it often starts on one side of the body before progressing to the other. So that was another thing we didn't really account for. Of course, disease stage. Last but not least, though, and very importantly for this group, is workflow fit. So we have this AI model that works well, but how are clinicians going to actually use it? So this brings us back to that epic thing I was talking about. So the electronic health records systems, where it's really easy for coders to implement extensions to that. And the clinicians can tell you, yeah, I really want to see the AI model output look like this, and I want it displayed to me exactly like this in my workflow, so that I'm already doing a lot and just make my life easy. Clinicians are really burnt out, by the way. So a big design challenge is, like, how do we increase the information presented to clinicians while not making them stressed out? So easier said than done, but there's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of clinicians are excited about getting more granular information from patients in remote settings, but how to do it in a way that's not going to increase clinician burden is a major challenge. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my wonderful research lab and funding sources. Research lab does all the work. And finally, I will take any questions. So thanks for your attention. questions? Yes.
I'm just curious, are there any like legal issues for optimizing for like specificity over sensitivity? Like if you get a device that's like, really good at telling when someone like has cancer, for example, but it's supposed to, but it does, it like fails to catch patients in the head, would there potentially be like pieces like malpractice suits in the case? Yeah, that's what it is.
That's a good question. So the question was about what are legal implications of optimizing sensitivity or specificity. There's a couple of answers to that. So number one, depending on the context of use of the model, if it's a regulated model, they actually sometimes need to get FDA approval. Not in all settings. So like if I'm just deploying a model in UCSF, I don't need FDA approval. If you're making a product and like selling it to other health systems, oftentimes you do need FDA approval. And in those cases, you actually have to lock the model, and then like you can't just change the sensitivity specificity. You have to tell the FDA, I chose these exact hyperparameters, and this is the performance on my study, and I'm not going to change it. And if I am going to change it, I actually have to go through this FDA reapproval process. So, like from a regulatory standpoint, there's that. But then there's also like, okay, well, what if it's not FDA? It doesn't require FDA approval. Like if you come to UCSF, like you can just create these models. I just talked to one of my colleagues, hey, can you start using this in your practice? And if they like it, then it'll start being used. And so in that case, it's not FDA approved. It doesn't need FDA approval. So in those contexts, right now, there's a lot of discussions on who should be liable. Is it the AI model or clinician? I don't know. But those are discussions that are going on. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned some of these things that you discovered when you shifted universities, you shifted the people to where your colleagues, like just talking with a new group of people, you discover all of these problems with how your original study, and the implications that might have. I'm curious, like, what systems exist currently to, be able to tack on or mention or include those, disclaimers that you've discovered down the line in your original publication, so that people who are looking at your publication don't know the context, don't have the context to think, oh, but, what if these problems that your colleagues pointed out, wouldn't necessarily know that unless you told them about those limitations.
Right. So the question was about basically, like, I learned all these things post-publication, and so there's a couple answers to that. It's a great question. So number one, a lot of these things actually are in the publications, and there's a lot of times reviewers do, like in peer review, reviewers are like, yeah, this is the limitation, and you're like, okay, I'm going to add that to the limitation section. So a lot of times our limitation sections are very long. So that's number one. Most of the time, that's actually what ends up happening if you go back and look at the papers. But if that doesn't happen, it also depends on the point of the paper. So for example, the Parkinson's paper that we did have, went into this really high impact journal in Nature, NPJ Digital Medicine. But the point of the paper wasn't that we created a clinically usable Parkinson's diagnostic assessment. The point of the paper is, hey, these models are not robust to device type and to handedness, and these are understudied factors in AI robustness. So that was the point of the paper. We didn't make any claims about this is an assessment that's, clinically useful yet. And also if you think about in terms of grants and things, so like our processes. So like we can, like zooming out, like we think of that initial study, even though it went to a high impact journal, is really a lo-fi prototype was meant to provide us preliminary data for future work. And so now we're putting in NIH grant proposals and everything to account for all these factors in our follow-up studies. So a lot of times the study process is iterative, just like in all of HCI. And so even though this was a very formal, large sample size preliminary study, we learned an important lesson that didn't have to do with the clinical context specifically, but was a cross-cutting methodological lesson. But then number two, we learned a lot of lessons that will help us bootstrap in the next assessment of our Parkinson's assessment on the way towards creating something that's clinically useful. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
Has there been any effort for standardizing model specifications, especially for private companies like Apple?
So the question was about specifying model specifications for private companies. I don't know what they're required or not. I don't work at those companies. That's a good question. I don't know. Does anyone know? This is meant to be a discussion as well. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I had a question more about the kind of the space of interventions that you're considering in your work. More in the beginning of the talk, they seem to be more like just-in-time nudging. And I was struck by the example of like stress prediction among nurses having high individual variability. And for the people where it wasn't very predictable, I was wondering, saying it's not very predictable kind of operates under the assumption that there is like some ground truth stress label and the person isn't able to report it, but maybe they just weren't able to introspect, or like maybe they have a lot of things going on. So I was wondering if if you thought about other interventions that maybe aren't as behavioral but target more of the cognitive processes that might also lead to behavior change or stress reduction without relying on prediction.
So you're asking about like cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in other work, yes. So we are looking at like LLM. I didn't talk anything about chatbot stuff, but we were doing a lot there too, and we're thinking about safety and yes. I didn't talk about it here, but yeah, we're totally looking at that as well. Great question. I couldn't talk about everything that I do today. I just wanted to give a bird's eye view of some of the HCI challenges. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm curious with the Parkinson's study. Were there things that you found in the original study with people who had Parkinson's that were at odds with or in tension with what you ended up discovering later? Or were there things that you also found in the original study that you wouldn't have uncovered had you only done a study with Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was like, did we learn anything from doing the community-based engagement? So for the Parkinson's study, not so much. I mean, the main thing was that making sure that it's accessible because it's the older population, make sure that a less technologically proficient population can use the app, use the website, and that it's like everything was big, font. It's like some things like that, yes, but nothing. I mean, we probably could have thought of all that before as well. So nothing like too insightful there, but there have been other studies where we did get some interesting insights. So for example, we ran a substance use study in Hawaii using the Fitbits, and we asked them periodically to provide annotations of their substance use and craving in real time, and we randomly sampled through the day. Now, we did this in Hawaii, and so a lot of our and we had an emphasis on Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Filipino populations, and especially in Native Hawaiian, there's this idea of pauhana, which is like after work time, the family gets together. And what a lot of our participants told us was that, hey, you're asking me to disclose my substance use like at 5:30 p.m. every day, but like that's when all my family's around. I don't want to talk about my substance use around my family. And so, things like that we learned. So that's a different study that I didn't talk about today. So in other studies, yes, in the Parkinson's, like very surface level things like font size. But great question, very important question. Yeah.
You talked about in the beginning one of the goals of producing personalized medicine for digital therapeutics was user engagement being high. I guess I'm just curious, especially for wearables, how are you measuring user engagement? Is that just like interaction time, looking at it, the aspect of effectiveness or like takeaways from that?
Very good question. Yes, the question is about how do we measure engagement in digital therapeutics? It's a big challenge. And first of all, I want to distinguish engagement versus adherence. So engagement actually is kind of easy to measure. It's just like logging. Did they open the app? Did they do stuff in the app? Adherence, like actually doing what the behavior change was asking them to do, that's a little bit harder. We have been playing around with I need to be careful because this is recorded. I don't want to be scooped. But we've been playing around with automatically measuring adherence. I won't say more. We have also, in a simple approach for a current study, we're just asking them after the fact, like, did you do it? So like not right then. And we ask them, did you do it? And we also ask them, like, how burdensome was it to do? And so getting back to that causal diagram, we're going to try to study how burden affects adherence. Great question. Open question in the field, too. Other questions? This has been a fantastic set of questions. Okay, well, if there is nothing else, then thank you all for your engagement, and thanks.